Well, that's certainly an interesting story for us to begin our new time together as we look at the narrative lectionary in the story. But let's back up a little bit and focus just for a minute on God creating the earth. God made the earth so beautiful. And God's the greatest artist of all times. And what God did was when he got in his creative mode, God looked down on the earth, or what we now call earth, and it was dark and void, meaning there was nothing. And in the first chapter of Genesis, it says, and the Spirit began to move over this space, and God began to speak. And God said, put the heavens up there. And the heavens came about. And then God said, put the waters under the heavens. And the seas and the lakes and the oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, they were created. And God said, move them over just a little bit, because right here I'm going to put the earth. And I'm going to make it round. And then God said, oh, it's good. But God knew that there was a need for lights to light up what he was creating, to kind of show it off. And so God said, well, put the sun over there. And the sun came about. And God said, put the galaxy up there and put stars in it, and put so many stars you can't even number them. And the moon, put the moon there and make it exactly the same size as the earth. And God said, oh, it's good. And then God said, and this is one that we sometimes have a little trouble with, but God said, make those little insects. And make the big insects. I have a picture in Africa of this insect that was as big as my toothbrush. But put them there on the earth so that they can dispose of the waste and dead animals and plants. Make the birds fly in the sky. And actually, God said, make that kakaboo, the kakaboo bird, and make it only chirp at night. And then God said, make the seasons of the earth so that the world is able to reproduce. And then flowers and grass and blueberries. I could never understand personally the blueberries. I can't stand them. And then God said, put the elephant out there to remind them of my strength. And then bring the clouds and the rain and bring the wind. And God said, it is all good. And then God decides to create the 7 wonders of the world. And he said, we can use a few more lights. So put the northern lights over here. And he said, I'm really going to get them with this one. Make the Grand Canyon and make it 277 miles long and put it right here in Ohio. No, I want to make Ohio flat. So put it in Arizona. And it's all good, God said. And then of all things, God decided to make human beings, you and me, in his image. And he created a masterpiece, you and me. And God said, it is very good. Well, then something changed. Temptation came into the world. And God told Adam and Eve, you can live in this whole place, in this garden, but just don't eat from that tree right in the midst of the garden. And they broke his commandment. And then they hid from God. And that's one of the verses in the Bible I've never been able to understand. They hid from God. How do you hide from God? But you see their relationships changing. And then Adam and Eve, they had two sons, Cain and Abel. And Cain killed his brother Abel because of jealousy. And it just went on. And then Adam and Eve had this huge family. And the descendants are all written in the 5th chapter of Genesis. And at the end of that, it comes to Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. But the world became a different place than what God created. And it doesn't get any better. And so God, and I'm going to go back to what I read earlier. And God said, and I even changed the translation. I used the Message translation because it's a little bit calmer. And it says, and the Lord was sorry that he made the earth. And he grieved in his heart. And God said, I'm going to destroy my ruined creation. For I'm sorry that I made it. And so God did. God destroyed the earth in a way that it's never been destroyed before. The flood came. And the flood covered mountains, and it covered all land and everything in its way. And it's interesting for me, in the 1st chapter of Genesis, there's 7 different times where God is creating all of these things, and God keeps saying, it's good, it's good. And then when it came to human beings, God said, it's very good what I've created. And then as we go to our scripture lesson today in the 6th chapter of Genesis, the question is, where did we get to the point for God saying, I'm going to destroy the earth, and I'm sorry I made it? Now, if we can get past the wickedness and the destruction of the earth, if we can sort through all of that, what we find is our God, Yahweh, in crisis. Because God is grieving over the earth. And God is hurt by the fact that his creation has refused to be his creation. And they, or us, we, have forgotten the number one responsibility why we were created in the first place. To take care of it all. And to take care of each other. And so we find God in a crisis. And God immediately decides to start over. And he brings the flood, and God kind of hits the reset button. And this story so clearly reminds us about what the world is about, darkness and sin, and how sin drowns our lives. But pay attention to God in this story. And you will see God recommitting to you and to me. You will see a God who resets the relationship between you and me and him. You will see a God who remains faithful to us. By the end of the story, the focus of all things comes upon a rainbow. A rainbow. And did you ever think about what the word bow is all about? Like bow and arrow, a weapon? For you see, this bow, this weapon, both ends of it, and this one's a little bit different, although if you follow it down, both ends sit on the earth, to show us that God has laid down his bow, never to use it again, never to be picked up again. The punishment, the weapon of God is over. Thus, the rainbow is a symbol of peace. It also is a reminder to God to change. We often get so wrapped up in ourselves, in a rainbow, that we think the rainbow is all just for us, reminding us of his promise. But every time God sees a rainbow, something interesting happens with God. So the rainbow is placed before us, and the promise is God will never do this again. And God places a rainbow over the earth, and as I mentioned earlier, at one time within one day there could be over 10,000 rainbows. Certainly reminding the world of God and his promise, but probably more for us. And listen to these words. Listen again. It says, when the rainbow appears, and this is God speaking, I will remember the everlasting covenant that I made with them. And God restarts again his creation and our relationship that we have with him. And just as he used Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and their wives, God uses you and me to restart the world, the creation. And in order to do that, this time, God outdoes himself. And he creates the greatest masterpiece of all, Jesus. Now let's face it, the world isn't much better off than it was thousands of years ago when the flood came. Maybe it's even worse. There's violence, there's mass shootings, people aren't caring for each other. And what we do to the earth, Chernobyl nuclear disaster, Exxon Valdez and the Gulf War oil spill, the Amazon forest is disappearing, global warming, algae, let alone trash everywhere. We do need to change those things. But when all seems lost, all of a sudden, our own personal rainbow appears. Jesus. And Jesus says to us, never again will I not forgive you. Jesus says, never again will you go a day of your life without grace and love. Never again will you be alone. Never again shall death haunt you, because death comes with resurrection and a new start and a new life. Now, there's 2 things I'd like to close with today. And the first is our baptism font. I was actually very shocked this week. And not that I have to know everything, being in ministry this long, but I discovered, and someone told me this, and I didn't believe it at first, but he said, you know, official baptism fonts have 8 sides. And I'm thinking, well, ours only has 5. I mean, I've done hundreds of baptisms here, and I've never noticed this. This has 8 sides. And it's symbolic of the 8 people who God saved. Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. And this baptism font represents how God will safely bring us through the waters and the floods of life. But secondly, do you know where you're sitting today? Anybody know what this area is called, this room? Nave, right. Oftentimes we call this the sanctuary, but actually this area is the sanctuary. And in the back, in the lobby, that's called the narthex. This is the nave. N-A-V-E. And you know what the word nave means? Ship. Ark. You're sitting in a ship. And actually, if you look up into the ceiling, the designer, this church was built in 1957. The designer prior to that wanted to make ships for places for people to worship. And this ship portrays the reality that your church and my church, with Jesus as the captain, is a ship that's protecting you and me from the waves and the floods of life.